Okay, so tonight is the second speaker series for 2015, and tonight's speaker series is another in an initiative that SSI has been taking to try and generate discussion around issues that affect refugees and asylum seekers, and tonight is no exception to that. Tonight's topic is on achieving justice for victims of mass atrocities, and aims to provide an overview of the various forms of justice for victims with a focus on survivors who are now living in Australia. And particularly as refugees. I guess this is a topic that is dear to the heart of SSI. We are an organisation who works with refugees and asylum seekers in various different contexts. We currently support around about 2,500 refugees each year, and we're currently supporting about 5,500 asylum seekers in the Sydney metropolitan and New South Wales area. And as you would appreciate, many of those asylum seekers and refugees have had to flee from situations of significant trauma, significant atrocities, and have had to flee multiple times in some cases in their journey to get here. Just recently I was hearing the story of a client of ours who had been through some terrible traumatic events and terrible torture, where he was believed to have information about the Tamil Tigers, and but despite the repeated torture against him, he had no information. Fortunately, he was able to get here through an asylum seeker method, and he's now in Australia receiving support from our organisation. But for him, receiving justice in those situations is an unresolved matter for him, and something that continues to be on his heart. And many of the clients that we work with continue to feel that in some cases that justice hasn't been done. And I'm really interested to hear what Stephen has to say to us tonight about this, and to think about how we can make a difference in the lives of people who have experienced mass atrocities. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank our guest speaker tonight, and we'll hear about Stephen in a moment. Stephen, our main speaker tonight, is the US Ambassador at Large for War Crimes Issues, and tonight we have Daz Chandler, who is going to be our facilitator for tonight, and I'll tell you a bit more about her in a moment. I do just want to thank Lara Warren and Mai Warren, who helped us to organise Stephen to be here tonight, and we appreciate your assistance in that. So I just want to introduce Daz Chandler now, I'm going to hand over to in a moment, who's going to facilitate this evening. So Daz Chandler is an Australian filmmaker with a background in broadcast journalism. She's passionate about human rights and is inspired by the democratisation of media and the rise of independent and citizens journalism. In 2008, she established Radio Lagi, an English language media project for young Palestinian refugees living in the Palestinian territories. Daz is on the board of the Sydney-based Refugee Art Project, where she serves as a media mentor and advisor. Her short film, Unstill Lives, documents the project's engagement with Australians' refugee and asylum seeker community, and has been selected to screen at international festivals inside Australia and the United States and Europe. She's currently in post-production with her first feature-length documentary film called, is it Amanda? Amandla, sorry. Which follows the life of a politically motivated young woman born the year of the Oslo peace process inside the West Bank. Daz's main interests lie in work that challenges preconceived socio-cultural and political notions and ideas, and creates instances of social engagement or points of connection between unlikely parties. So please join me in welcoming Daz, who will now take over the microphone.
Thank you, David, and it's a real pleasure to be here tonight, and more of a pleasure to introduce our special guest, Ambassador Stephen J Rapp from the Office of Global Criminal Justice at the US State Department. Stephen has led successful prosecutions in both the war crimes trial against the Liberian President Charles Taylor and against members of the Rwandan media who were convicted for direct and public incitement to commit genocide. More recently, as America's Global Ambassador at Large for War Crimes, he's been referred to as the Obama administration's point man for global prosecutions of the world's most notorious war criminals. We're very, very fortunate to have him here with us tonight to talk about the various ways in which justice can be achieved for victims of mass atrocities. Welcome, Stephen.
Well, thank you very much for hosting me this evening, and it's an honor to be with all of you that work every day for persons who've been through enormous trauma and make no mistake about it, people that make decisions to leave where their parents, their grandparents, where their family, where their ties, where everything that they've known all of their lives, they've made the decision to leave there and to take a journey of enormous risk and to come to places such as Australia that they don't know and in which they know every aspect of their life will be challenged. People have made those decisions have made them because of the horrors that life in their place of origin is presented them, and to work with them to provide the services to overcome that trauma, to make them welcome, despite sometimes broader public attitudes about societies not having the capacity to deal with these things. I think it's an extremely important work, and I salute you for doing that. And it's so essential in the world in which we all live. My own experience, when I came to the role of being a diplomat in a different way than many people who carry the title of ambassador, and understand I'm an ambassador at large. Our ambassador in Canberra has a nice house and can work for the United States with an individual country. My job is really to go everywhere where I can have an impact on the issue of global criminal justice, of holding people to account for the worst crimes known to humankind. And to be at large, people joke and say, well, that's a little like being a fugitive, sort of on the run all the time because of the law. And that's the case. I travel since appointed by President Obama 6 years ago, around 220 days a year. This is my third official trip here to Australia, though. You can read the list of my destinations in terms of the world's difficult places. I mean, leading the list is the Democratic Republic of Congo that I've visited now 12 times, but most recently been very present in the Central African Republic and in South Sudan, but in the region, quite engaged with the Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, Burma, Myanmar, and with historical events in Cambodia, though I'll be in Timor on Friday. And everywhere it's about working to try to achieve justice in the places where horrible crimes have been committed, to hold people to account who are responsible, not the lower level people who are made to do it, but the higher level people who sort of put into motion evils which have destroyed the lives of thousands of their fellow human beings, to hold those people to account and to bring the law to bear on behalf of victims and survivors, and to, we hope, over time, deter these crimes. I became a federal prosecutor in the United States. Hard to calculate years now. Let's see, at the end of 1993, and before that, I'd been a defense attorney and someone that spent my life to some extent on the other side of the table, the other side of the courtroom. But when I was appointed a federal prosecutor, my real focus was violent crime, and looking at it always from the point of view of the victim or the survivor of those crimes. What could the law do to protect people from those crimes? And so every evening was a meeting with victims and survivors and others about how the law was working with them, whether it was succeeding or failing, whether it was serving their interests or not. And when I prosecute these crimes, I'd see the individuals before us in court who had made the decision to destroy the lives of others for their own selfish interests and want to send a signal to them, to others, that there are consequences to those acts. And so it was extremely extremely active on cases of violence against women and violence in communities by powerful forces, sometimes forces of organized crime that would take over and intimidate and extort and selfishly destroy life and activity so that they could prevail for themselves. That drew me eventually to the idea of doing it at the international level. You know, if you deal with a murder case with 5 people, and the whole family murdered, and you achieve justice, you say, how about going someplace where they murdered 500,000, and is it possible to achieve justice there? And in 2000, even though I came from a rural state in the middle of the United States, which sometimes we weren't as violent as other places, and sometimes I didn't have enough bad guys to prosecute, I sometimes thought, but sought a position at the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, which had been established by the United Nations to hold to account those who had led the murder of 800,000 men, women, and children in a period of only 100 days in 1994. And we're still facing the consequences, I mean, not to mention the horrors of every one of their families and the survivors and everything else, but that led to more than 2 million people going into refuge in a neighboring country that we now call the Democratic Republic of Congo, and continues to have repercussions in terms of violence and retribution in that region, led to what was called the African World War at the end of the 1990s, and 6 countries were in what was then called Zaire, but it's now called the Congo. These kinds of crimes have immense consequences and cause whole great dislocations of populations as people try to prevent it from happening to them, and where acts of retribution and vengeance cause further flows. But the idea that the International Criminal Tribunal was established by the UN Security Council a year after another tribunal was established for the former Yugoslavia is that if we could hold people to account, we could deter these crimes, we could prevent, we could take out the folks that were really responsible for these acts, and restore, that could have a role in restoring peace and security. However, in putting on trials, one had the challenge, I mean, there's several challenges. I mean, one, you have to deal with the people that went through it, the witnesses, the survivors of those crimes, who were essential witnesses to what happened. And in the Rwandan context, truly horrific experiences beyond really imagining. Though when you get involved in these things, you in the middle of the night, you reimagine yourself involved, because you'd have people who would have been in a churchyard where they thought they'd be safe and would have been told by authorities, we'll keep you safe, and eventually there'd be 10 or 15,000 people there. And then the authorities would unleash the killing militias with machetes and with clubs with giant nails in them, and over the course of 1 day, 2 days, with sometimes the killers stopping for beer and drugs, et cetera, but they would continue to hack and kill people in that context. Some people would resist, and military would then throw grenades, and as a result, people would largely wait to be killed. And there would be a few survivors who would see some things, but who would have been found alive beneath the bodies of their own children. And so you talk to those individuals about telling the story, and you can imagine, what is it? What is it that this will gain you to go relive that experience? And so it was so essential to build the trust of those individuals that this would be of value. And of course, as in any prosecution, and particularly in international justice, it's not, we didn't have in front of us in an international court the person who held the machete that killed their child. That person might not still be alive, or they might be tried in Rwanda. I won't get involved in what happened afterwards, but Rwanda itself had a change of government. The group who was representative of the victims took over the country the former government won the genocide but lost the war, and they've tried more than 100,000 people, the lower level individuals. The International Court was established to bring to trial the government ministers, the military, the media leaders who'd escaped Rwanda, who went off to 26 different countries, and we were able to use the power of an international court and the cooperation of states to bring to trial the people that were responsible. But of course you had to prove the responsibility of people who weren't at the killing site. And so the challenge of these cases was that connection. In the media, that was one of the case that I was assigned to handle. We had a 34-month trial of essentially the top two people of a radio station that had incited the killing of the so-called cockroaches, the Tutsis, and proving, and they didn't have it, and they weren't on the radio themselves. They founded the radio station, and proving their connection to the, one, proving what the radio had said, finding the tapes, translating them, interpreting them, dealing with an African language to understand exactly what was being communicated, and then showing how these individuals were responsible for that was the enormous challenge of the case. But I do remember, because indeed in all of this kind of criminal justice, as one deals with victims, you ask yourself, what I'm doing here, is this going to help? I think it's going to help the world. I think it might help the next country not go through that experience. But does this really make matters worse for the individual? And you're not so sure of that, because, you know, and the other aspect of this is that in any of these crimes, you know, if we hold the former prime minister, and we did, guilty of genocide, first prime minister in the history of the world convicted of that crime, and he goes to jail for life and shipped off 3,000 miles away to a prison in a West African country where he lives pretty comfortably. What does that do for anybody else in that society? Does it change it for them? And so there's that issue. And is there any reparation? Is there any money for the fact that there's no longer a breadwinner in the family, that people have, is there any money for the horrible injuries that people may have experienced that physically are impossible to fully recover from, and emotionally maybe even more impossible to recover from? And indeed, these courts have suffered, as most courts do, when you're talking about serious injury committed by people whom you can't get to their money if they have it still. They may have spent it all committing the crime. You're not really providing any financial relief for them. Is it valuable? But I do remember in the media trial, and I don't want to exaggerate this particular experience, but I remember the day, because it was certainly a satisfying day. We finished the trial 3 months, 4 months later. We had the judgment from the court, and we had accused persons who had been extremely prominent. One of them, who had founded the radio station, was a professor, had a degree from the University of Paris, came to court every day in a suit and tie. And an intriguing thing about the Rwanda genocide is that all of the perpetrators that we prosecuted had university educations, most of them in the West. They had reasons for doing this crime. This is not and to some extent they always tried to argue it was wild, out of control ethnic violence. No, this was violence that they had created, incited, made happen so that they could preserve their own power and wealth. But that didn't diminish the fact that they came to court and they were there in their suit and ties, and the witnesses came from the hills and the refugee camps to testify against them. But and indeed, I can get into how complicated it was to prove this case. It was a close run thing whether we could convict these guys at all. In the end, they were convicted, historic convictions, the first convictions in the history of the world for incitement to commit genocide through the media. And I remember talking to a Rwandan afterwards, and he said, and he'd been to court every day, watching through the bulletproof glass, and obviously still suffering the effects of having his whole family wiped out. And I said, well, what'd you think? You know, he said, he was the greatest day of my life. He's a man that we couldn't even raise our eyes to look at when we were in the village. And today they stand and are convicted of horrible crimes and sent to prison for life. You know, this is for my family, for my children. You know, there's been justice. Still had to eat the next day, still had to, you know, make it in a very tough environment, and who knows where today. But that does have, I think, enormous value, that the truth is told. And of course, you know, the law is about power, and what's happening in cases of violent crime, whether it's spousal abuse, whether it's police brutality in one sense, whether it's the violence by gangs, et cetera. It's people basically using that power and saying, you're nothing, I'm something, I'm powerful, I control, you know, and what the law needs to do is to turn that around. And what can be greater than for those that have the power to kill thousands or tens of thousands to do the same thing. And at least for those of us that engage in it, it is though that we can discourage others from doing the same thing. Anyway, I can go on and talk about experiences in a variety of situations and what's been done. We hope to establish justice. Just to understand for a moment what's happened in the world and what hasn't happened in the world, because sometimes there's a sense that there's a court in The Hague that will prosecute every bad guy. And why do they prosecute some people and not others? What is it? How is it? And you know, people could say it's at best you could say a kind of a crazy quilt. In some places there's a solid fabric to catch people. In other places there's nothing at all. Why is that? Because this is a world of states and of instruments that have been created that can provide justice, but they often have required action by the Security Council, and that's possible to achieve somewhere and not others. But basically the idea that powerful people should be held to account has been with us in particular at the international level since Nuremberg, since after World War II, when the victorious Allies held Nazi leaders responsible, later Japanese leaders in Tokyo responsible for crimes against the whole world. It was viewed as victor's justice, because obviously there were, in Nuremberg, there were Soviet judges who, and Stalin had been responsible for horrible crimes, and certainly those weren't judged. But in the course of trials in which the Nazis' own documents and films were used against them, it was possible to hold people to account for horrible crimes and to hold top people to account. And that had not been done before. There had been court-martials of soldiers who were violating military regulations for committing crimes at a low level. But at Nuremberg, it was clearly established, as the American prosecutor said, the common sense of mankind demands that the law shouldn't stop with little crimes by ordinary people. It needs to reach men who possess themselves of great power, and you make deliberate and concerted use of that power to set in motion evils which touch every home. Then for about 40 years of the Cold War, we didn't have any of that, because that took unanimity by the great powers, which in the UN system was represented by the Security Council, in which Russia had a veto, we had a veto, Chile, China, when the Beijing government took its seat in '71, had a veto. And so you needed a consensus if you're going to get it. And after the end of the Cold War, we had these horrible crimes in Yugoslavia and Rwanda. It was possible to establish courts. Since then, in various places, when we've been able to build a consensus for Sierra Leone, for Cambodia, for a few other places, we've been able to establish international courts. An International Court of Justice, or International Criminal Court's been established, which my country, everybody knows, isn't a party to. Australia is. There are 123 countries in it. It has the power to prosecute, but only for crimes committed by those countries or on their territory. And so it doesn't cover Syria, it doesn't cover any country in the Middle East except for Tunisia and Jordan. but every country in Europe, every country in South America is a party to it. And the UN Security Council can, if there's no veto, send a case to it. But there are other instruments, and the expectation that I talk about from the Rwanda genocide, where we held a prime minister to account for the Yugoslavia one, where President Milosevic was brought to trial, Sierra Leone, where President Taylor was brought to trial, is that there needs to be justice elsewhere. And so we've used other instruments in the world, like the UN Human Rights Council, to establish commissions of inquiry to inquire when there's horrible crimes committed in Sri Lanka or in Syria. So at least reports are written or documents are gathered. And then under the international system, the encouragement is to try to get countries to do it themselves, to hold at least some people responsible. And so we use various diplomatic efforts to encourage that and demand it and say that if you don't do that, there can be consequences. But it's not a system that is complete or full, but it is one where at least I see that everywhere I go, because of the fact that we have, in some cases, held leaders to account, there's an expectation that we need to do it everywhere. And that expectation and that demand, I think, is increasingly being fulfilled. Not fast enough, and not in a world in which these violations that I've described don't continue to happen. Because, sadly, we're used to horrible things happening in war, and horrible things always happen in war. But increasingly, we're seeing non-international conflicts. I mean, when was the last time you really had a real international war between two sovereign states and governments? It's pretty rare. You have these civil wars, and you have non-state actors, and you have horrible acts being committed by governments against their own people or by non-state actors against others. And the tactic that's often chosen isn't to go attack the enemy's soldiers. It's to attack the enemy's civilian allies. It's to go after the soft target. And so you have conflicts in the DRC in which you hardly ever hear of a soldier being killed, or even a guerrilla being killed, but you hear of thousands of ordinary citizens being killed or raped, because that's the way they send a signal. They go after the soft target, the ethnic group is represented by the other side, show them by killing their civilians. And so, and efforts to terrorize by showing films of people being beheaded, or in the case of the Islamic State, or as I dealt with in West Africa, chopping off of hands, or using intestines as roadblocks, or horrendous things like that, are ways in which you intimidate. And you do this by going after people that are weak and defenseless. And it works. That's the sad business in terms of gaining and holding power. And so we got that in the world, and we have to counter it. And that takes more capacity than we presently have. But I think the will is building, and there are successes, and I can certainly cite places where I think conduct has changed. But with that opening, let me go ahead and I'll turn it back to Daz, and we can have our discussion. Is that okay? Okay. Thank you very much.
I could speak to you for hours. I wish I was seated next to you on a plane somewhere. I've got lots and lots to ask you. One of the things that I found really interesting that you said just then, you spoke about those moments during the trial in Rwanda where you questioned the value of what it was you were doing in terms of justice. I thought it'd be interesting to kind of expand on that for a moment and explore the notion of justice, especially, given your role in the international criminal justice schemes or ad hoc tribunals in Sierra Leone or Rwanda, for instance. So in that context, what was justice conceived of, or what did you perceive justice to mean in the play out of those trials?
And when I don't know if this is working, okay. I was satisfied myself because I know the rules and I know what I need to achieve is that justice by the book, justice by the statute, etc., and justice even by maybe the global media will be achieved if I'm successful in holding these individuals to account, getting them convicted of genocide or crimes against humanity or war crimes, and people will report that as a win. And so that's clearly why I went, and obviously, even though you can't win every case, and even in cases you win, you don't win every count, and of course, you're not. If you have that win, the question has to come. I mean, part of being a thinking individual is what you're doing anybody any good? And when you take individuals and traumatize them and bring them through the process and bring them into court and try to treat them as carefully as you can, and then watch them beat up as the law requires by defense attorneys who are cross-examining and putting them to that they come to lie, that they're there for some ulterior motive, that the reason they're testifying is because we're getting them a relocation, and they're just doing it to enrich themselves, and they're going through all of that kind of thing, and you put people through that kind of process, and in the end, their lives don't change, or you're right doing that to individuals, and of course, we know often, and it's one of the things I often have to confront. I deal with people that work on humanitarian issues. You try to go into a refugee camp and interview people. The refugee people will stay away from here. We don't want to get involved in this. We don't want. This will endanger our ability to help folks. And you find many people in the humanitarian area who steer away from justice because it will block access. And of course, we would say to them, what do you want, more refugees? Do you want more people coming out, more people suffering? We've got to find people that have information. But you have to respect that maybe they are right. Maybe you aren't doing those people any good. Maybe you aren't achieving justice. So that's what I'm asking. And keep in mind that justice is an ideal, but it's not something you ever accomplish 100%. You come close, and justice can be achieved imperfectly, and at the end of the day, I can sit back and say, yes, on balance, that was positive, and that's what I find, that on balance, it's positive. But when you go through it day by day, and when you ask people to assist you, when you ask people to put their lives on the line, you constantly have to ask the question, am I serving that person? Am I serving his justice, her justice? What am I doing? For me? Is it for them? And if it's not them, you don't do it. You shouldn't do it. That's what, and so as a prosecutor, I mean, keep in mind, a prosecutor in a Western, common law system is an interesting character, and you get in continental European civil systems and in the ICC now, the idea that victims need separate representation in court. So you get sometimes a lot of high-priced lawyers representing victims, and sometimes they're actually they're gumming it up, in our view. On the other hand, there's also the prosecutor who just represents the state. I mean, when I was a U.S. prosecutor, and we had a professional system, everyone would call us the government. The government said this, the government said that, and the jurors would say, hey, we don't like the government, we're going to vote against them. But, I said, no. I like in California, they call it the people are here, et cetera. But who are you? Who do you represent? And to some extent, you're there representing the state, you're representing public order. Is that individual victims? No. But from the point of view of if you're going to do this as an individual, and if your orientation is, I want public order in the state, I don't think that's enough. I think you have to be in that process because you see yourself not like necessarily like some private lawyer doing a lawsuit, but you have to be there for the victims, those and others. And if you keep that orientation and their best interest and their consultation at heart, then I think you're doing the right thing.
So, how were they involved in the court or prosecutorial process, and Was there much local community consultation?
That varies enormously between institutions. In the Rwanda court, very, very little. Now, that was a reflection of the fact that the International Court was established in Arusha, 800 kilometers from Rwanda. The government in Rwanda had been in the Security Council, both as the genocidal government, and after the Kagame won the war and ended the genocide, it was there afterwards on the other side, and it actually was the only country in the Security Council that voted against the establishment of the Rwanda Tribunal. It said, no, it needs to be in Rwanda, and it needs to have the death penalty. And unless it is, then we're voting against it. So they voted against it, and for a long period of time had a pretty hostile view. They said the international community should come in and help us do the cases here. We know the justice, and what are you doing over there? Now, meanwhile, of course, they had the low-level killers, and particularly after they went into the Congo and brought several tens of thousands of them back, they had lots and lots of cases. We had all the folks that were rich enough to get out of Rwanda and get to Europe, get to other places in West Africa, and that tended to be the government ministers, the high-level people, the media leaders, the business leaders, the territorial administrators. So we tried those people. But we needed to have the Rwandan witnesses. We needed to go over there, and we had a branch for our investigations in Kigali, and periodically the government of Rwanda would get angry and shut it down, or they would create issues for us. And we tried to engage in public meetings, but the government, which has its authoritarian aspects, didn't like people conducting public meetings of them itself. And so, the input from Rwanda was limited. It was only, and then because we could also investigate that government itself and the crimes that it committed as it was ending the genocide, there was that level of hostility too. And for a long period of time, the court in Arusha, the UN court, hired very few Rwandans. We had only ones that were doing interpretation, because nobody else in the world speaks this, or almost nobody else in the world speaks the native language, Kinyarwanda. So it was only in the 6th year of the tribunal we actually started hiring Rwandan investigators. So we were cut off in that way, and when we did our cases, did they even hear about them? We developed outreach and radio programs and a variety of things, but it was cut off. When I was in Sierra Leone, there we formed a court that was a partnership between the government and the UN, where a majority of the judges were international and a minority were national, but 60% of our employees were Sierra Leonean, and we had an outreach program that had district outreach coordinators in every part of the country, 13 of them. We had a regular meeting with civil society. We actually hired civil society representatives to spread the word about the court. It was a country where, because electricity was unreliable, only 2% of the people had television, where no newspaper printed more than 500 issues, a country about 6 million people, parts of it would take 4 or 5 days to get to by road, but because of our outreach program, everybody in the country knew what we were doing. We set up screens on the Hill, we answered questions. I traveled the country, as my predecessors did, and got questions from school children who would come up and cite the statute against us and say, you're not doing the right thing, you should be doing this, and we'd respond. And we'd bring out defense attorneys who'd say, we need you guys to testify for us because the prosecution's doing it wrong. So we had this kind of national discussion, and this is one of the reasons why I like the model of the hybrid court that works in the community with the people, but at the same time, through the international participation, maintain some independence, because naturally, otherwise you get people wanting, the government wants its side presented, and maybe that's not the same as the victim's side. Mm. So I think that was that in terms of consultation and discussion, far better in the latter than the former. But that's lacking now in countries that have gone through transitional justice themselves, say in Argentina or Colombia. Then, of course, the classic point is everything should be victim consultation as you establish a truth commission, if you do prosecutions, et cetera. It's constantly a process, because if it doesn't reflect the public's interest, it's not a good one. So that's ideal. But when we do things internationally, That's often because that's not possible, because you don't have the assistance of the government enough to get in there and do it. You may have the hostility of it. It may be impossible to do it, and the only way you can do it is externally. So, and if you can't get in there, should you not do it? No, if it's horrible crimes, you need to do it. So it's not always possible to have the level of consultation. Some of the rest of what the tribunal was doing, they tended to be supportive of ours, and they didn't have a lot of, people didn't have a lot of question in their own mind about the importance of the radio, because the presence of particularly this radio station had been such an important aspect to the genocide. First of all, just a little bit of background. I mean, Rwanda, before RTLM, they'd had a government radio station, boring as mush, you know, with the national, the most melodic thing on it was the national anthem. The president gave an address every morning, or recorded a spiel, government announcements, and brought, you know, just the usual kind of propaganda, which nobody pays any attention to. The guy we prosecuted, Ferdinand Nahimana, had been essentially the government's media baron, but he'd been fired because he was using this media in the view of some to incite some ethnic hatred at a time before the genocide, when there was an effort to do compromise and coalition, and he was pushed out. Well, then he decided to form an independent radio station that would be private. So RTLM wasn't the government radio station, it was a private radio station, sold shares to all the sort of power structure people, and they had the radio that they wanted. Now, this is at a time when, during the political compromise, they were trying to come up with elections, and so his argument is, we need this in order to sell our side in the election. But he went and hired football announcers. He did interactive sort of things. It was like moving from black and white to Technicolor. And the radio was dramatic in terms of effect. But then, over time, in '93 and into '94, it became more and more extreme, more and more targeting the cockroaches, which, you know, what that exactly means took some effort to decode, but people in Rwanda knew what it meant. And so during the genocide, people who were in these churchyards, or people that were in hiding, were listening to RTLM on their Jeep-Little FM radios, and to get information about what was happening. And it provided sort of communication to the militias and others. It provided sort of confirmation to them that they were doing what was necessary and needed. Sometimes it even became a force for direct control and communication, or direct people toward specific targets. So in my view, it was like air support in a campaign where you got soldiers on the ground and you got air knocking out the heavy weapons on the other side. Air control being essential to controlling a battlefield. And so it was doing that kind of thing, and it really had the effect. And so the opinion in Rwanda was this was really important. Now do keep in mind, the government also, since then, has been much more restrictive on the media, more than we would like to see, because they say we can't let the media go and cause this again, and that tends to mean that they want to discourage dissent and other things. So sort of a prosecution of the media can be misused. However, if you read the case, these people aren't prosecuted because they thought ill of Tutsis. They were prosecuted because they were inciting the mass killing of Tutsis. It wasn't speech. It was action, and speech was part of that action.
We're going to just got one more question before I do that, and it's just relating to your role as the ambassador at large to the United States. You were appointed the first year of the Obama administration, and you took over an office that under the Bush administration had, according to one of your predecessors, spent more time shielding the US from justice inquiries than advancing the agenda of international justice. So it would have been a pretty tough gig, I'm guessing, like for you to take on a role at that time.
It's I don't think so tough. Do keep in mind, I mean, when I took over, President Obama had been elected, and there was, I think, among people in the world that had been negative about the Bush administration, there was an enormous amount of hope, certainly represented by the fact that the president was, in October, in his 8th month in office, awarded the Nobel Prize. And so, to some extent, we benefited by the international community being more welcome and really happy to see the United States having made this change. At the same time, that needed to be given substance in terms of what we were doing. And one of the things we did that changed, as I said, the United States isn't a party to the ICC, and Obama has not called for us to be parties to the ICC. But we took up the position that we hadn't taken up as observers within the ICC Assembly, looked at the laws and determined that we could assist the ICC in its cases in terms of sharing information, protecting witnesses, helping them make arrests, and took very affirmative steps to help that court succeed. At the same time that we made it clear that just as in the court's principles, you don't go to the international level if you can do it at the national level. The ICC has this principle of complementarity, which is that the international court needs to complement what's happening at the national level, be an addition, fill the gap, not be the whole show, which is different than Rwanda or Yugoslavia. We had primacy in those courts. We had the power to take a case and say, national people, you can't have that case. But so a lot of our efforts was trying to do it at the national level. And we still have, I think, compared to other countries, more interest in doing things like the hybrid courts or the mixed courts that are close to the scene of the crime, thinking that will have a better long-term effect in that society than taking a case to The Hague. But we recognize that getting it done at the national level or coming up with some arrangement to do it at the regional level in a mixed court depends upon having an effective court of last resort. If, it's sort of like the 800-pound gorilla that's off the stage, people, may change their behavior because of that and do the right thing. And so we want the court to be effective in that way. And we've had a situation with the ICC where, it's had 3 trials finished in 10 or 11 years, 2 convictions and 1 acquittal. And frankly, it hasn't been as effective as it needs to be. And we want to help it be that. But as I say, we were able, I think, to receive a positive response. At the same time, as President Obama said in his peace conference, or his peace prize acceptance, he was accepting this prize at a time that the United States, he was commander-in-chief of a force that was engaged in war in Iraq and Afghanistan, that was facing powerful enemies at the time, where he was using force in ways that many people, possibly sort of instinct would say, this is a bad thing. We should avoid this kind of thing, and recognizing very much that in a very difficult world, there are times when there is a legitimate use of force, and that you need to take action to protect people from terror and atrocity, and that's going to raise questions. And so even while we're out there pushing for justice, I haven't heard it yet, but we'll hear questions about U.S. double standards and things. Are we living according to the standards that we're asking other people to live to? And those are legitimate questions for which I'm glad to provide answers.
Questions right now.
First question is exactly who is we, because you use we a lot,
Mm-hmm.
and is we connected to The Hague, and how do you actually differentiate as to whom you would like to prosecute and whom you won't? That's my 1.5 question. And my other question is, when it comes to people like Robert Mugabe in Zimbabwe, who most of the world really think that he's a pretty bad guy, someone like him, if you decided to prosecute him, how would you do it? Because it's hard to sort of, get into his regime, bearing in mind that he's got such a closed door.
And I think, on the we question, I'm here, getting, as a U.S. ambassador at large, I'm talking about the interests of the Obama administration. Sometimes, obviously, that involves us working with other countries and allies like this one and trying to achieve justice. But, obviously, if I'm talking about my time period beforehand when I was an international prosecutor, if I'm discussing the media trial, I'm talking about what I was at the time. But today, if I'm talking about the action that we are taking, I'm talking about the U.S. government. In the question of who to prosecute, understand that when we go to work to establish a court, or when a case is sent to the ICC, it's not a question of, we're establishing this court so you can prosecute Charles Taylor. We're establishing this court so you can prosecute Assad or whatever. These courts have to be set up in a way in which prosecutors are free to investigate and make decisions on an independent basis without political interference about who they have a case against, and we cannot dictate to that. Now, states do sometimes have an interest, because frankly, if they charge somebody and they can't get them arrested, that's not going to make them look very good, et cetera. So obviously, we may communicate to prosecutors that if they if they tell us they're going to indict somebody, we can say, right now that won't work. In a few months it might work, but the prosecutor doesn't have to listen to us, But it's for the prosecutor to make that decision, and that's not just him or her. They have to get approval of the court. You mentioned Mugabe, and Mugabe is a case, and I talked about the quilt. That's certainly a place where the quilt has a hole in it. There is no, Zimbabwe is not a party to the ICC, or any case to be brought against Zimbabwe. These aren't brought against states. It's always individual criminal responsibility. But for a Zimbabwe situation to be referred to the ICC so that a prosecutor would investigate Mugabe, would take a decision by the Security Council to refer a case to the ICC. Now, the ICC only has jurisdiction over crimes that have been committed since 2002. I don't want to get involved in the details of Zimbabwe entirely, because there were brutality against political dissidents, and there was violence during election campaigns, and people mistreated in prison, and violations of human rights. But international justice is generally not about prosecuting people for being dictators or for denying people a free vote or those kinds of things. It's for it's for governments that have engaged in mass atrocities, committing violence against thousands, tens of thousands of people. And even though there are bad things happening in a lot of countries that don't come to that level, international justice prosecutions really don't get involved in the smaller level things. When it comes to Zimbabwe, historically, there are allegations in the late 80s of massacres against the Mtibali people with thousands of victims. Perhaps during that era, there could be crimes subject to sort of international atrocity standards. But that's a period before the ICC came on the scene. So those aren't crimes that could be easily prosecuted at the international level. In the future, Zimbabwe could change. It could establish its own court. It could ask the international community, as Cambodia did, to go back and help it look at those crimes. It could do that. That for those kinds of things, it's generally taken the country itself a willingness to take on that kind of period. So we're not likely to see a case involving Zimbabwe based upon what's happened today.
I'm going to ask what you were going to pose. The Obama administration, has been heavily criticised for doggedly pursuing its political rivals, such as, Libya's Gaddafi and Syria's Assad, and then protecting allies like Israel. I'm interested in asking a personal question now, and I wonder how this political approach sits with you as a man who believes in justice.
Understand that, we're back into the realities of the world and the sort of level of crime. In the case of Assad, we have a regime that tortures children and sends their bodies home to their parents, even at the very early part of the revolution, before there was any Islamic State or Jabhat al-Nusra or anyone else. And 220,000 are dead, and three-quarters at the hands of the regime that engages in chemical weapons, uses sarin gas against its own people. And so these are horrendous crimes that cry out for justice. The Gaddafi case is a little more, obviously Gaddafi had a brutal dictatorship where nobody could raise their head without having it chopped off. But it was the particular events in 2011 when he was facing internal opposition, and he threatened to chase every one of his opponents house to house and closet to closet, kill them like rats. And the international community at that time, because they were, frankly, he had done so many crazy things and had alienated so many people. Actually, there was a moment of consensus where the international community said, "We'll send this case to the ICC," and then later a decision to intervene for civilian protection purposes, which hasn't been possible to achieve in some other situations that are more serious, just based upon a long pattern of his conduct, which had alienated everybody in the world. The Israel situation, we can discuss, go into the specifics. I spent a lot of time dealing with the Israelis, people that do investigations of their own military, particularly in the wake of the 2008-2009 operation in Gaza, and you get these operations in which hundreds of Palestinians are killed.
I was actually there at the time.
And the response on the other, when there's rockets being sent off into Israeli cities, but relatively few are hitting civilians, and some of it's because of the fact that they're not well-guided missiles, and some of it's because of Israelis' own air defense. So people in the end say that there's a disproportion. Look at how many Palestinians die, look how many Israelis die. International law requires that you look at each shot, each individual case, and the Israelis, if you talk to somebody like a General Mandelblit, will look at each case where there have been abuses and say, well, we did this and this and this to protect civilians. We gave warnings. We even did a knock on the roof with a blasting cap so people would leave before we hit it. We took all these steps to protect the civilian population, and under the laws of war, we don't have to sit and allow ourselves to be subjected to these rockets. We can attack them, and if our opponents insist on gathering their rockets in schools, etc., we don't have to avoid attacking that as long as we take action to minimize. People react, obviously, as they do emotionally, and we react in terms of, personally, in terms of the suffering of Palestinians for what happens there. But this is a legal analysis, and in the Israeli case, it's now, frankly, since events in 2014 before the ICC, there has to be analysis that there was intentionally targeting a civilian, so that there was disproportionate force used for a military target, these sorts of questions. And whether it's not a question of killing people, torturing people, precisely as they can, but they do it in places that are very built up, and so there's a lot of damage. But they have legal arguments that have to be dealt with, and it's a different situation, albeit one that requires that they answer to the law just like anybody else answers to the law.
Your personal safety and the safety of your team as you try to bring these terrible, terrible people to account for their evil deeds. Did you ever feel seriously threatened, and if so, how did you manage that?
I've never felt seriously threatened. I do keep in mind that, when I go out in these places, we may have investigators and others. When I do things as a diplomat, my own government indeed has a very high level of expectation, and we've had horrible things happen. I know Chris Stevens well because I was in Libya in July working with him on trying to get the Australian defense team member released by the Zintan militia, and of course he was killed 2 months later. And so we tend to make sure that our diplomats are safe, and there are quite a few places in Central African Republic where I've been stopped from going there more often than I've been allowed to go there because of security threats. So I don't find a threat. Now that's not to say prosecutors don't, and in some countries killing the prosecutor, killing people that are doing honest work is one of the ways that you get rid of cases. That in my own country, there's the sense that if you kill a prosecutor, you just get another prosecutor. And witnesses, however, you can't lose witnesses. They're irreplaceable. And so to a large extent, I tend to always say that in my mind, if I go, there'll be somebody else, so there's no point in hitting me. But that's what I had in my own country, and the protection that's provided to me as a diplomat, and that's provided to international prosecutors who do their work. And for those people that are trying to do justice in their own countries, in situations where law enforcement, they may be among the honest people, and there are others that are actually bought and paid for by violent interests. Certainly there are a number of cases of people that have taken their own lives, that have been at risk. A friend of mine, Joan Kagezi, was the chief prosecutor in Uganda for cases involving national crimes, including low-level people with Joseph Kony, including the Al-Shabaab bombers who bombed Kampala during the World Cup in 2010. And I saw her in Kampala about 2 months ago, or a month and a half ago. Her kids were in the car, and she stopped at a fruit stand to buy some food, and was shot and killed on the streets of Kampala. So people do, people that I see do face those kinds of consequences and dangers. I've been lucky enough to be protected against them in my case.
My question is the notion of international justice. So the international justice should be universal in the sense that they should goes beyond any time, any area, any ideological difference. But my question is that here we have a notion of international justice, and here we have also a lack of international body which implements or executes this justice, which is international. For example, United Nations. So this here is a little bit like an ironic situation in the sense that we have the notion, but we don't have the body, international body, which executes this ideal. So how optimistic are you to implement this international justice across many continents and applying it to many injustices? And also there's also cultural understanding of the notion of justice, and the difference is huge. And we try to minimize these differences through the notion of international justice. But again and again, how can we have this kind of very effective implementation of this international justice in our world where UN is so too weak to pay attention to variety of the injustices, including, for example, Rwanda. That was the not only the failure happened in the Rwandan society, but also whole international society paid not enough attention to stop the genocide. The whole genocide happened to just the very eyes of the whole world. And now that the genocide is happening in Syria and other parts of the world, the UN is so weak to step in to stop this international justice. And how, as a humanity, we can implement this international justice. We should uphold forever, but at this stage, it's impossible.
I think you point to a problem, and the question is the solution. And we don't have a global government. Closest we get to it is when the Security Council gets unanimity, and obviously that's not going to be in every situation when you've got cases of particular Security Council countries that strongly support international outlaws, for instance. It's real hard to get it at those cases, at least in terms of having a court prosecution in the near future, until there's at least a change in government in that country where those crimes are committed. I tend to view it as a bit of the half full, half empty sort of issue, but always looking to try to fill the glass and bring it more completely. If we can deal with a Rwandan leader like the Prime Minister or others that are responsible for killing 800,000, and you can get it done in that particular place, and you can show how it can be done, and then you can work to establish that same rule elsewhere. That's the way you build the system. Some might say, well, if you can't try every war criminal, don't try any. And that's a little like saying to a prosecutor, if you can't get every bank robber, don't try any. You get who you can get, and you do it right, and you seek to get every offender, and you seek to deal with every situation. And you use these institutions to build public demand and expectations. So even in countries where the government may be disinclined to support it, eventually they face pressures to say maybe we will go along with it. So you have to start somewhere, and you're dealing, of course, with a world where not every state is democratic. Different people have different interests, etc. But making it as broad as you can is one of the ways that you can build toward the kind of universality that you're talking about. And when you can't get the court, maybe you get the Human Rights Council to do an investigation, as they've done in Syria for the last 3 years, as they've done for Sri Lanka, as they've done for Gaza, frankly. There can be inquiries that way, and the record can be established, and the evidence can be gathered. If you can't, you may be able to support documentation efforts. I'll talk about this at UNSW after tomorrow, that efforts that we can make to support private organizations, particularly of communities in diaspora, working with international experts to develop solid evidence. That's been done for Sri Lanka, for Syria. So we can do a variety of things, and then we can use that evidence and present it, and continue to push and push and push and push until we finally do get a court. So that's the way we build it. Now, on the universality aspect of it, I mean, there's a lot of variation in the world around social practices, one kind or another, but mass killing of innocent civilians, targeting men, women, and children for rape, for murder, people that aren't engaged in conflict, this isn't permitted under anybody's religious or ethical traditions. And so occasionally you get people that say, oh, these are just Western values. Well, I've never heard I've never talked to a single victim of one of these crimes that say, oh, no, we don't count. We have a different value. It's okay to rape and murder in our society. Quite to the contrary. Leaders may come forth and try to cover themselves and wrap themselves into some kind of tradition that they're justified, or that it's improper that they be taken on. But these aren't these universal. Human rights are universal, and the right of protection against lethal and wounding violence is a universal concept, and it's that all people in all societies are entitled to, and these instruments have been adopted, and things like the Geneva Convention ratified by every country in the world, even North Korea, and other international human rights instruments, broad ratification. So these are values that represent common denominators across our society. side.
Here
So
in
it's not Western.
Sorry to cut you off, just going to say, here in Australia, we don't have a human rights mechanism like the European Court of Human Rights, or what's it called, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. So I'm interested to know whether the establishment of something like that here might help with that, and how optimistic you are that that could actually happen.
I think it's important to move in that direction, and I know I became heavily engaged in the region over issues of Burma and Myanmar several years ago, before we had some opening there, as we did with the after the Thein Sein election, the release of Aung San Suu Kyi and release of political prisoners and other things that are positive, understanding that there's still substantial challenges. But I remember traveling to Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, other countries, pressing for support for a human rights inquiry for Burma, and generally running into ideas that this was interference, and we don't support interference. We want to work on capacity building and cooperative sort of approaches, and indeed that's other regions have started there, but have moved beyond that. And obviously, I'd like to see more of that in the region, but it's in the hands of governments, and there isn't the same consensus in the region as there is in Europe or Latin America. I think we're quite clear on that. But that's not to say you don't have instruments like the Human Rights Council, of which Asia and Pacific region are heavily represented, that have taken action as they have in the case of Sri Lanka, for instance. And so it's possible, if it doesn't happen regionally, it can happen globally.
And staying with Myanmar at the moment, obviously there's currently boatloads of Rohingyans floating off the coasts of Thailand, Malaysia and Indonesia. And the reports of gross violations of human rights are far-reaching: crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing. In Australia, Australia during the 2005 World Summit committed to protecting populations from these crimes by endorsing the responsibility to protect obligation, and they reaffirmed this commitment once again in 2013 at the UN General Assembly. I'm just wondering how you see Australia's responsibility to protect and how that obligation applies to the situation in Myanmar, and what we can do here at a regional level as well as an international level to ensure that some decisive action is taken.
Well, I think, understand it's Australia, and it's every country in the world that has adopted and supported the responsibility to protect. It is important to note that it does have these various pillars, and the first pillar means you work as hard as you can with the government of that country to help it. Well, primarily it's its responsibility, but then beyond that, you work as hard as you can with that government to help it meet its responsibility. And it's only when there's a failure that one tries to impose a kind of solution, such as international justice. And that's only in the most extreme situation that responsibility to protect would authorize the use of military force for its use, and that is something that in our world almost always requires approval of the Security Council, and there you've got the difficulty of vetoes. But I think what this comes down to is that where you do have this issue of profound discrimination against the Rohingya, and where you do have violence being committed against them by organized groups, it involves us using the pressures that we have to encourage change of approach, a tougher stance toward those committing that violence, and toward acceptance of Rohingyans as citizens of Burma, as others are, and not into the kind of statelessness that they're in, and that all of us in our bilateral relations with Burma, as much as we appreciate the moves that have been made, taking sanctions and removing them as we look toward other ways to engage and invest. We have to be very careful in that process to understand that those steps on our part really depend upon action in a way that will create a future for Rohingyas in their own country, and the failure of the government. Even sometimes, I mean, they don't even want to call them Rohingya; they want to call them Bengali people that have had country for 3 generations, not really being nationals. And obviously, the situation in Bangladesh, that's not their country. They may have distant relatives there, but that's not a country that's able to take them in. They need to be accepted in their home, recognized, and have the right to actively participate in the selection and the economic life of their country. And that's what's expected in that society, as it's expected in our own societies, to accept the people in our midst and accord them the same rights that everyone else has. But that's something where we're dealing with another country, and we work with its government, but we use the pressures and the levers and the persuasion and the effective arguments that we can make to get there.
Stephen, sorry, with respect, I don't think you're answering her question.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of her question over there is about Australia's role. What's your view about Australia's role?
And what to do, you know, in respect to what's happening right now, the boatloads of people basically just waiting for someone to help them.
Well, let me make clear that you know, if I'm not, when I come to a country and I'm hosted in the country, I don't get involved in that country's policies when it comes to making the decisions that countries make. It's for people to understand those issues themselves, and obviously all of us, every country in the world has obligations under the refugee conventions that they need to comply with, and if you can, you know, we can look at places where we do comment on policies of other countries and our own when it comes to these issues. But obviously we encourage Australia and other countries to work to resolve the problems help resolve the issues in Burma at home, and then to comply with their obligations under international treaties when it comes to refugees.
You mentioned before about the issue of governments not wanting to interfere in the matters of other states, and we've heard the Australian government over the past couple of years use a similar kind of argument for why they don't speak out against human rights issues or human rights violations in other countries. They say that's a matter for that country, they're a sovereign nation. To what extent do you think that excuse of respecting a country's sovereignty is still accepted these days as a reason not to intervene?
Well, certainly you hear that from a number of countries, and our friends in China are particularly common. It's common for them to say that's internal affairs, and understand what the responsibility to protect is about, and why it's significant, and why the cases I've talked about in international justice are significant. I mean, the world as it used to be, under what we call the Westphalian system arising out of the end of the 30 Years' War in 1648, was based on the sovereignty of states. I mean, to some extent that protected people perhaps from interference from other countries, and sometimes that interference had been very destructive. But in the case of the worst violations, now we're not talking about countries that choose the wrong policies on one issue or another. We're not talking about even issues as serious as, you know, freedom of speech or regular elections or a variety of things. Countries will make their own decisions. We may criticize them. They sometimes may be inconsistent with international human rights law. But on the question of genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, ethnic cleansing, which is really generally a crime against humanity, a persecution or displacement, violence against a civilian population to drive it off and out of an area. In that case, we're saying that that's the concern primarily of the country, because that country has an obligation to protect its own citizens from that. For heaven's sakes, not to commit those acts itself, but to protect them from non-state actors or anybody that would be doing those crimes. But if they don't, the responsibility passes to the international community. And there is, with appropriate mechanisms like the Security Council action, the ability of the world to intervene in the borders of a sovereign state, to hold its leaders to account, to bring them to trial, to bring Milosevic to trial from Belgrade and hold him responsible in The Hague, or to bring Laurent Gbagbo, the former president of Cote d'Ivoire, to The Hague and try those individuals for acts that they committed in their own country. Whether it drove off a single refugee out of their country and affected another country, those acts within their country are not exclusively the concern of that country, they're the concern of the whole world. Now the question is the mechanism, and frankly, beyond that, in the most extreme situation, to pass a resolution and send in an intervention force to stop it, etc. That can be done too, though often that can be more counterproductive than helpful, but it could be done. So those are things, and so that's where sovereignty has been changed. But it's not sovereignty to go and change every aspect of the system, to come up with a different culture, to decide things about how they're discriminating even against people. But if they're committing violence against those individuals and they're failing to take action to protect people from that violence, then you end up in a situation where it is the concern of and not just the concern, the responsibility of other states. So that's the significant change in our international system. You still, however, have a hard time crossing that line. And you will have countries like China in particular say, no, we have to respect internal affairs. I mean, they look at you prosecuting somebody for shooting people down in their main square, and they think about Tiananmen in 1989, and they say, well, we want to be held to account for this kind of thing. And so you can understand why some countries don't want to go there. But in 2005, they signed on to the responsibility to protect. In 2011, when Gaddafi was threatening to chase people from house to house and closet to closet and kill them like rats, they sent the case to the ICC, 15-0 in the Security Council. So there have been precedents where we've been able to step up and get action in internal affairs because of these serious crimes. Not for other things, but because of these serious crimes. So that is new, that is different, and that's what we're talking about.
I have one final question, if that's okay. I noticed earlier you talked about the need for keeping the interests of victims at the forefront, and that some humanitarian workers find it a challenge to be involved and contribute towards bringing justice to crimes. I'm wondering what advice you would have to humanitarian workers and to victims of atrocities that they can do to help bring about justice in these situations.
I mean, there are ways to do this, and understand for anyone to make the decision, for instance, that they want to step forward and be a witness, that they want to see a criminal prosecution, is not a step that you impose on an individual. But, I've found it, example, the kind of things that, I mentioned the country that I've been to 12 times, the Democratic Republic of Congo, where we have, where it's indeed more safe, more dangerous to be an innocent woman or girl than it is to be a soldier or a guerrilla. And I know one of the people who's a good friend of mine, and I gave him an award on behalf of Physicians for Human Rights in New York 2 weeks ago, Dr. Mukwege, who runs Panzi Hospital, that works on fistulas in these horrendous situations where women's whole guts have been torn apart and may not even be able to hold their urine in their system. And he's the gynecologist that's operated on thousands of people. You go to his hospital in Panzi and see the hundreds of people, for whom he's saved. And of course, there are people there that have been raped more than once, that have been his patient in 2004 and then again now in 2015. But he also has legal workers there. And if people want to proceed with a criminal complaint against the Congolese soldiers, whoever did it with them, they're invited to do that. And they get provided with counseling on how to do it and how to follow the complaint, and others that can tell them what sort of consequences they're going to face. You provide access to justice. You don't push people in that direction. And so in these other situations, I mean, important to note that in a refugee situation, that there should be, I mean, refugee camps I'm thinking of, but opportunities for people to work with justice. And of course that happens here in Australia. I was meeting with a group today who was working on Sri Lanka that's dealt with refugees here that provided information, who were interviewed by the UN Commission that's doing an inquiry that will be published in September. So that is happening to a point, but of course they're doing it at a safer place than say a refugee camp closer to the scene. But the idea is always to provide access and then to make sure that in terms of our standards and everything, we're doing it in a way that protects these individuals and also helps them deal with the consequences, the psychosocial consequences of dealing with a system which can potentially even further traumatize the victims. Not so we don't do harm, but we open the possibility that people that have information that could stop this crime from happening to others see the kind of catharsis that can result when occasionally someone is held to account, that we open that possibility as something that may be essential to them.
I guess it raises the importance of post-arrival resettlement support and the need for access to psychological services that help with that healing process, but also access to international lawyers and people that can help with those processes. And I guess having access to a system that doesn't further re-traumatise people, as you said. And so I think what you've provided for us tonight is an interesting consideration of some of the complexities of trying to seek justice, but it is pleasing to hear that there's at least some groups out there trying to bring justice in these situations. And in Australia, there's often a lot of rhetoric around regional solutions and looking at solutions that go beyond Australia. And I wonder if bringing more justice to, I guess, more prosecution of perpetrators of these atrocities, maybe we could start to make an impact on why people become refugees in the first place. And so, we can all hope that more of that does happen and that some of those legal and political and social barriers continue to be challenged by people like yourself and others. So I'd like you all to join with me in thanking Daz and Stephen for their presentation tonight. Thank you all for coming tonight. We have used up all of our time and more. Keep in mind that SSI does run these speaker series 4 times a year, and you're more than welcome to come, and if you've come tonight you should be invited to subsequent sessions. You are welcome to hang around and have some more food and wine and talk with our guests, mingle with each other, but if you need to go, you're welcome to go. Thank you again, and please keep tweeting. Thank you.